So welcome everyone to today's Smith in the World panel. My name is Emily Beaudry. I'm the internship coordinator at the Lazarus Center for Career Development, and I'm joined by my co-host, Lazarus Center Praxis Assistant Kimberly LeBron. This is the third panel of the Smith in the World Conference series. So if you've been attending so far, you'll know that for the past 2 Fridays, we've featured students with internships in art and communications and STEM and health professions. And our fourth and final panel is next week, research and data analysis. We'll provide that registration link a little later. But whether you attended those other panels or just this one, we welcome you today. And whether you're a student, a prospective Smithy, faculty, staff, family, friends, supervisors, colleagues, and all other supporters, we're so happy you're here to help support our students. A little background about this conference. The Smith in the World Conference is intended to celebrate and share students' off-campus experiential learning. So that could be in the form of internships, community service, research, or study abroad. Students offer their reflections on how those experiences impacted them and enriched their academic and professional paths. So our panelists today are going to give short presentations about their summer 2021 internships, focusing on their projects and the impact those experiences had on them and how Smith helped prepare them for success. Today's topic is US history and social impact, and I'm very honored to introduce our panelists. First, we're going to hear from Nyla Conaway. She is a junior and an Africana Studies major, and she spent her summer as an archives research intern at Karamu House in Cleveland, Ohio. Second, we're going to hear from Georgia Coates. She's a sophomore and a double major in history and Italian studies and a concentration in archives. And she spent her summer as a research assistant at the Filson Historical Society in Louisville, Kentucky. And finally, we'll hear from Eliza Menzel, another junior and a double major in American Studies and Jewish Studies. And she spent her summer as an asylum intern with Keep Tucson Together in Arizona. Today's session is being recorded, so we just ask that everyone stay on mute, but we encourage you to absolutely submit your questions using the chat tool, and we'll collect those questions after everyone's presented, after all the presentations are finished. But we also welcome you to just unmute yourself and ask your questions directly at the end of the presentations. So with that, I will hand over to Nyla.
Alrighty, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, are you all able to see this and hear me? Okay, cool. So hi everyone, welcome again to my Smith in the World presentation. My name is Nyla Conaway, and thank you so much for being here. I'm going to be talking about my internship at Karamu House. Okay, I'll start by introducing myself. Again, my name is Nyla Conaway. I am a junior and I am an Africana Studies major. I'm originally from New Haven, Connecticut, and the internship that I participated in at Karamu House was a part of a larger summer internship experience with the group called Summer on the Cuyahoga. And Summer on the Cuyahoga describes itself as a program that brings together 70 to 80 students for an immersive summer internship experience with programs that are designed to help students explore the professional, civic, and social offerings of the Cleveland area. And again, I worked at Karamu House. Oops. Oh gosh, sorry. Oops. Okay. So Karamu House is a community performing arts center that is in Cleveland. It's recognized as the oldest African-American producing theater in the United States. They were founded in 1915. And in Swahili, the word Karamu means a place of joyful gathering. And Karamu House truly exemplifies this. It is a place where people of different races, religions, genders, and socioeconomic statuses come together through the arts. And the purpose of my summer project was to explore the Karamu House archives, as well as other archives in the Cleveland area, such as the Western Reserve Historical Archives, to broaden our knowledge about Langston Hughes' life. We had 3 guiding questions, and those questions were: who was Langston Hughes as a young artist, what was Langston Hughes' relationship to Karamu House, and how did he sustain that relationship over the years? So as we explored the archives, we used these 3 questions to propel us, and they pretty much guided what I looked for as I looked through all of the materials. And lots of people know Langston Hughes as a Harlem Renaissance author, or at least that's pretty much what the extent of my knowledge was before I did this project. But he had a life that was much fuller than that. But information about Langston Hughes is scattered in many different places. And this summer we were tasked with bringing that information all together and making it accessible to people by having it in one place. And Karamu House has a very strong connection with Hughes, and we aim to make these connections clearer and fuller. And in the end, we were able to compile all of this information into a detailed report that followed Langston Hughes' life from his birth to the time that he died. And I included a picture on the right that kind of shows what Langston Hughes' connection to Karamu is. So this was a picture in 1942, and he's standing next to the building plan of the new Karamu House building. And then I also included just a little, this was an excerpt from Wikipedia, and it just highlights that Langston does have connections in Cleveland, but it's not really highlighted as much in the material that you find about him online. So there are definitely a ton of highlight moments from this summer, but one of, I think, the best highlight moments for me was having the ability to interact with so many primary sources. The collection at Karamu House was definitely very extensive. And on the screen, I included just 2 of the letters that we have between Langston Hughes and the founders of Karamu House. So these are, the letter on the left is from 1942, and the letter on the right is from 1959. And again, this is just 2 of the many letters that were exchanged between Langston and Karamu House. And Karamu House was able to sustain a connection with Langston that lasted for over 40 years. He started as a student assistant when he was in high school in Cleveland in 1916. And this connection went all the way to when he died in 1967. His plays were performed at Karamu House throughout this time, and they're still being performed today at Karamu House. Every year, Langston's Christmas play, Black Nativity, is performed at Karamu even today. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about why I actually wanted to be at Karamu House. So I have to learn in really big letters because that was one of my main reasons. I wanted to learn about the intersections between archives, between history, and between my major Africana studies. And I wanted to experience working in these fields. And I created this little cycle on the right side that shows, this is a picture of me and some of my Africana studies peers and some of our professors. And this is just this is an activity that I did in one of my classes last fall. And I think that the work that I do in my classes is definitely very connected to what I was able to do at Karamu House. And then I also wanted to include Karamu and then being connected to the world. And I think that this is important because Karamu's history is very wide-reaching, and it connects to so much more than just theater, and it's more than Cleveland. It connects to so many different places. And then also just knowing that Karamu is a place of joyful gathering that made me want to work there even more, because I think that that's just a wonderful theme and a wonderful motto that they have. So I saw this quote on a New York Times article that says, "I keep thinking about how the archive is still alive. We're still learning things about people that we already know a lot about." And I think that this describes the essence of this project. Langston Hughes is a figure that so many people know about, and we already have a lot of information about his life. But in working in archives And in working in the Karamu archives, I was able to learn that there's so much more information about Langston Hughes that we don't know about and that we're still figuring out about. And I think that that's definitely something that's very important that I learned. And then I'll also say that I was able to learn so many new ways to interpret history. And one of them being that history helps fuel so much of the work that we do today. And from exploring the letters and exploring the archives at Karamu House, I was able to see firsthand evidence of so much of the greatness that has happened historically at Karamu, but I also got to see some of the turmoil that happened as well. And I think that this showed me how important it is for places like Karamu to still exist today. And then it also showed me how history keeps the past alive. And like I said, with being able to experience those letters, I was able to see information in an unfiltered and an unedited light. And I was able to view the past without any interferences from outside opinions or outside sources. When I'm looking at these letters, these are the letters that Langston is, these are the letters that he typed on his typewriter. I'm not like seeing them from Wikipedia. It's like, this is the material that he truly interacted with. So that's another thing. I also want to talk about some skills that are outside of the historical thinking skills and kind of just life skills, I describe them as. So one of them is self-pacing. So during the summer, I worked in a hybrid position. So some days I was at the Karamu site and some days I did work at home. So a lot of that work was independent, and I had to make sure that I was keeping a schedule and making myself organized to make sure that I did an appropriate amount of work. I did a lot of digitizing work of the documents. So we'd have the letters and I had to scan them so that I could have access to them when I'm off site. And I had to read through all of the letters, and there's definitely a lot of stuff to read through. So just making sure that I was actually reading these in an appropriate amount of time. And then also making sure that I was keeping an open line of communication with my boss, Raquel, and just updating her with how much progress that I was making throughout the summer. That was definitely very important. And then in terms of archival skills, I got to create finding aids and do data entry. And pretty much what finding aids are, I made a huge document that contains all of the information about Langston's plays from that Karamu House performed. So we started in the 30s and then I went all the way up to the present. And then another fun archives thing that I got to learn about was when to use clean hands versus when to use white gloves. And that was something that I didn't know about, but we used white gloves when we were handling like photographs or something that your fingerprints could get on. And then for all other material, we just made sure that our hands were clean and dry. And then I included this picture on the right that just shows some of the boxes with all of the materials that we worked through. And this was in our archives room at Karamu. Now I'm going to talk about some obstacles. So I think, and how I overcame them as well. So one of my main obstacles was definitely managing my time. So kind of like what I said, I did a lot of independent work, a lot of reading and writing. And I had the entire summer to work on this, our end project, which was the report. And it seems like the summer felt like I had so much time, it felt endless. But it definitely is a limited amount of time. So I tried to overcome this time management issue by just working in blocks and trying to split up my time. And I still am able to do this when I'm doing work at Smith. I have a ton of reading in my classes now, and I try to just split it up just so I don't have a big chunk of reading to do, and that definitely helps. I want to now talk about just some reflections that I've had from my summer at Karamu. First of all, I'm so thankful to my boss, Raquel. She's in this top left photo. And I'm thankful to the entire team that was at Karamu. Definitely, as I said, Karamu exemplifies the values of being a joyful gathering place. Working there definitely felt like I had a family. It was such a sweet and caring place. And then I also want to say that the history and the present of Karamu is not just theater and it's not just performing arts. I think that it's theater history, but it's also Black history and it's American history. There's education and community engagement. And I included this photo, this bottom photo. This is of some of the Karamu students. They're at a neighborhood night in Cleveland. And this is from their arts education program. This photo on the right is from a performance that they had. It looks empty, but I was early, so that's why no one is in the picture. So I'm definitely very thankful to my Karamu team and to the Summer on the Cuyahoga team. And then I also just want to share some more reflections and just life views from this experience. I definitely feel very inspired by Langston Hughes's life and just getting to learn about him. Langston moved around a lot, and I learned this from reading all of his letters. He was in Chicago, he was in New York, he spent some time in Pennsylvania. And I think it makes me think about movement and exploration in my life. And from looking at his letters, it seemed like he just went to a lot of different places. And I guess that makes me just think about having a plan and just knowing that I don't always need to have a plan in my life and I can explore and, I can experience new places. And I definitely think that I felt that when I was in Cleveland because I did not expect to go to Cleveland and do this internship. But it was definitely it was a really great experience. And then I also just this idea of providing access to historical materials is definitely something that I want to continue doing. I don't know exactly how it will show up, but it's something that I want to keep doing. And yeah, I'm very grateful for this entire experience. And yeah, that is all. So thank you so much. I'm gonna stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Nyla. And I remind our audience, if you have any questions for Nyla, please pop them in the chat and we'll get to those at the end of all the presentations. But next, I'm going to hand it over to Georgia Coates.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Get that up. Awesome. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone see? Perfect. All right. So my name is Georgia Coates. I'm a sophomore at Smith College. I'm a history and Italian studies double major. And I think what's most important for the research project I worked on last summer is that I'm an archives concentrator. I'm also a native of Louisville, Kentucky, which is part of how I ended up working in my hometown last summer. So today I'm talking about my research as part of the Sustaining Slavery Project at the Philston Historical Society in Louisville, Kentucky. So over the course of 2 months last summer, we searched through questions of freedom versus enslavement and how capitalism in the Ohio River Valley provided a foundation for the domestic slave trade and how materials were produced and traveled between both enslaved and free people's hands. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into kind of a contextual summary of enslavement in the Ohio Valley from around 1830 to 1860. So we have this perception today that enslavement and freedom are kind of these mutually exclusive ideas for people. Like you are only enslaved and you are only free. But this area all around the Ohio River completely blurred those lines and was actually known as the borderlands of slavery. So while many enslaved people were, for example, forced to toil in metalworking factories on the Ohio, other Black Americans were living in free communities, such as a relatively well-documented and large one in Madison, Indiana. But this freedom that people were able to take for themselves was always unstable, as police and slave catchers, which were essentially the same occupation in the 19th century, would actually kidnap rightfully free people and sell them back into slavery. And you can kind of see, I put this kind of image that was put in the Anti-Slavery Almanac that details that interaction. And that kind of just brings us to Louisville's dark antebellum history. So enslaved people were captured all around the region, all in Illinois and Indiana and Ohio, and even further afield, and were brought back to Louisville. And these people were later sold down the Mississippi to New Orleans, Louisiana. So it's important to remember that at this time we have westward national expansion. So being sent to the Deep South was often a death sentence to many enslaved people because commodities there, such as cotton, rice, and sugar, all had their unique and deadly dangers when it came to cultivating them. And the phrase, quote, sold down the river actually originates from these painful losses. And for many, that horrible journey first began in Louisville. So in summary, enslaved and free Black people in the Ohio River Valley had many different experiences, and many lived lives in which they moved in and out of slavery, often sent back in by force. And so that's kind of the backdrop of the time period we were researching in last summer. So now on to the Philson Historical Society, which is the archival collection that I worked at last summer. The Philson Historical Society actually began as the Philson Club, which was full of and funded by rich white men who basically like to collect stuff and talk about it. But over time, the name has been changed to Philson Historical Society, and is now working on telling the stories of not just the historic elite of Louisville who like to collect stuff, but also the stories of people of color and those less privileged in the city. My supervisor was Dr. Patrick Lewis, who is the Director of Collections and Research at the Philson. And I worked with him on a project he developed, which we are calling Sustaining Slavery. I worked with him and one other research partner from the University of Kentucky. The basic idea of the project is to map out the locations of businesses and commercial enterprises in Louisville and the surrounding area that were notably involved with the slavery institution. So the map itself, which has been created with story map software, is clickable and offers contextual information above, below, and beside the map itself. The content of the website mainly covers the role of the production, shipping, and use of different materials and how they sustained the slavery industry in the Ohio Valley. So for example, on the slide, you can see in this image, hemp was extremely important in rope making, which in turn fed the steamboat industry, which would ship not only goods produced by the enslaved in the area, but would also participate directly in human trafficking down the Mississippi. And you can also see in this image to the right that items such as sugar kettles were produced in metalworking foundries in not just Kentucky, but also Indiana and Ohio by enslaved people that were hired out to work in these factories. And then they were shipped down to Louisiana to be used by other enslaved people in the production of sugar. So there's a huge circle here of sustaining the slavery industry all around America. But to get kind of into the meat of the research for this project, so this may seem kind of counterintuitive, but the most interesting part of the research we did was that it was done all online. We took this limitation of the COVID-19 pandemic and we turned it into a contrast in our research. So while we're researching solely online, we're detailing how physical materials were made and then used to sustain the industry of slavery in the Ohio Valley. But what this would look like for me, so every day I would get on my computer and work on data entries of various businesses that I would find advertisements for in city directories. So we would look at the city directories of Louisville, Lexington, New Albany, Indiana, and the Covington, Newport area in northern Kentucky. So I would take these and make entries out of each business. And so each entry was listed by the names of the owners of the company and were classified in our entries by what kind of items they produced or what they shipped. So I would look up, once I had this whole a huge spreadsheet of entries, which you can see to the left. I would look up each and every one of these entries in newspapers of the era. So I would look for articles or more commonly classified ads, which you can actually see at the right here. These ads would offer more information. Often 19th century advertisements contain coded language for products that related to plantations and the enslaved. So you can see in this bottom one here, it says country produce, which would refer to items produced in interior Kentucky plantations. So looking for this kind of coded language required a trained eye and a knowledge of 19th century advertisement language. But for me, the really difficult part, this was the biggest challenge for me in doing this research, was finding coordinates to map the businesses on. So I don't know. Surprisingly, 19th century addresses don't equate well to today's maps, in case you didn't know. With Louisville, actually, it was relatively easy to find old maps with streets that don't exist anymore. So, for example, take Water Street, which is now I-64 in Louisville. So it's like right up next to the river. I was able to find businesses that had that kind of address fairly easily, but with smaller cities like Covington and Newport, which are now basically the sprawl of Cincinnati, those were super difficult to map. I had to throw some entries because they were virtually unmappable. We didn't have the kind of maps that were able to pinpoint where these addresses were. But once we did have coordinates and entries filled out, we could map it on the story map. So here's a couple of screenshots of the live version created by Dr. Patrick Lewis. It was just put up recently. Not all of the data is uploaded yet, but a good portion of the Louisville specific entries are live. So you can see on this left image that you have all these points on the map, which each of them can be clicked on, which actually opens a pop-up. So take, for example, I click on Eliza Menzel. You can see in the next image that a pop-up that looks like this would open up with information on the specific entry, as well as pictures of advertisements found in city directories and in newspapers. So during this last summer, I learned that it's possible to use strictly digital archives and still come out with a project that does real work. Sustaining slavery, I think, as a project demonstrates to audiences of researchers and hopefully in the future classrooms, the widespread complicity of Americans in the institution of slavery and human trafficking. So this idea that someone didn't have to actually be participating in human trafficking or own people to actually be a part of its foundation. And that it was extremely difficult to avoid even consuming products that were produced by enslaved people. So in addition to bringing attention to America's complicity in slavery, the Sustaining Slavery Story Map also highlights how we could make research materials more accessible. So if we could be able to digitize other sources, not just newspapers and city directories, we could make research so much more accessible to not just historians and students, but to everyone. So overall, what really interested me personally about this project is the work it does to dispel historical myth making. So there are a lot of untruths that accompany this historical period, especially about the ideas of slavery and freedom and whether they're mutually exclusive or you can move in and out of them. I really love that using today's tools, such as digital interactive mapping, we can reimagine and reinterpret the issues of both the past and the present. And we can actually help the next generation not fall into the same traps that we have in the past historically. This research also makes it harder for people to turn a blind eye to this part of Louisville's past, which has been obfuscated over the last century through demolition of historic buildings and the introduction of large freeways in the city. But overall, I thank you all for listening. Thank you so much for coming. And I really hope going forward, we can continue to do projects like this that bring light to truths that have been ignored for a very long time. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Georgia. I hope you can share that link to your project in the chat at some point so people can check it out after the session. Thank you.
I gotcha.
And then finally, I'm going to hand it over to Eliza.
Hello, just give me 1 second while I share my screen here. Okay, can we all, is everybody seeing a presentation? Loading? Okay, great. So hello, my name is Eliza Menzel, and today I'm going to be sharing a little bit about my experience interning with an organization called Keep Tucson Together. So here's some information about me. I'm a junior double majoring in American Studies and Jewish Studies. I've listed some of my academic interests here, and I'm from Framingham, Massachusetts, which is where I did my internship from remotely this summer. So the organization I worked for is called Keep Tucson Together. It's a project of No Más Muertes, or No More Deaths, which is an organization that works to prevent the deaths of individuals crossing the Sonora Desert, which Tucson is in. Keep Tucson Together specifically is a grassroots group that works to prevent deportation, family separation, and other types of inhumane treatment of immigrants. They also work with people to obtain DACA, citizenship, and work authorization, as well as to work to get people freed from detention centers or obtain forms of relief like cancellation of removal and asylum. So my involvement, I started volunteering with Keep Tucson Together in fall 2020 as a volunteer. During this time, I drafted a lot of humanitarian parole and bond requests, which I'm going to explain a little bit in a minute. These were especially in high demand due to COVID and the terrible crowding in ICE detention centers. So humanitarian parole requests, they're documents submitted to the courts that ask for a person to be allowed into the country, or in this case, to be released from detention and stay in the country on the basis of a humanitarian emergency like COVID. And then bond is what immigration officials require as a guarantee that a person will come back to the courts for their hearings should they be released from a detention center. And so starting as a volunteer helped me gain more of an understanding of the organization and the work that went into getting individuals released from detention before I actually started working in the asylum department. And I also learned what to look for to make a case more compelling to the courts. Going from receiving delegated responsibilities to delegating tasks to others myself was an interesting transition, and I was definitely grateful to have had the prior experience volunteering when I got the internship position in summer. So here's a little bit about my day-to-day at Keep Tucson Together. I'm just gonna briefly explain all of these categories. So case notes, I did a lot of case notes towards the beginning of the summer. These are documents made for each asylum case that detail basically an asylum seeker's biography and their reasons for seeking asylum, so that everybody working on the case has the same context and can refer to it. And to do that, I would go through all the documents we had on an individual and basically compile all of the relevant information. Most importantly here was determining a person's particular social group, or PSG, which is a basis for seeking asylum that basically says a person was persecuted specifically because of their belonging to a certain group, and that they are deserving of asylum for that reason. Some common ones that you might find are queer people and religious minorities are often strong PSGs for a person to have in the courts. And then stipulations for relief are sent to immigration judges to encourage them to grant asylum or other kinds of relief to a person. And it argues why the individual, quote, deserves relief by focusing on the social groups they belong to, as well as their positive equities, which is basically things they have done or could do if they're allowed to stay in the US. So things like work history, community ties, and children in the United States are really important for these documents. And then country conditions basically contextualize the case to a judge and provide various kinds of evidence to show the extent to which a person has been persecuted and the dangers that they might face if they're deported. So this would be gathering things like witness testimony or letters of support from individuals who know the asylum seeker, also looking at political and social circumstances in their country of origin. And the pattern in all of this work is that it was all about shaping the person's story to make the courts more amenable to letting them stay in the US. And a lot of the time I was encouraged to think like an immigration judge instead of like myself, in that, be far stricter as to what I would, more than I would consider deserving of asylum, to try to get people the best chance of having success in the courts. And then in June, the Biden administration made changes that allowed for prosecutorial discretion, which is a mouthful. And it basically means that ICE attorneys regained the power to grant relief to asylum seekers instead of having to defer to the Trump administration's order to deport as many people as possible without actual consideration of the case. So after that, we worked to get as many people's cases removed from the courts as possible. And these tasks made me more and more aware of the issues that surround this merit system of immigration relief. So later on in my internship, I was tasked with completing an I-589 interview for a Tucson client. An I-589 is the application that an asylum seeker submits to the immigration courts in order to have their case considered. I'll refer to this man as Jesus just for privacy. He had been previously a small business owner, and he had been very violently extorted and threatened by a gang in his hometown in Mexico. And he arrived with his family of 4 as an asylum seeker in, I believe, spring of 2020. And so when my supervisor asked me to do this interview, I was appreciative to be trusted with the responsibility, but I was also pretty apprehensive because of the weight that this can have for an asylum seeker. I worried about balancing avoiding re-traumatizing him while still getting enough evidence to make a strong case. And when the day of the interview arrived, I was pretty nervous, but I used some tools that I think Smith has helped me develop to carry out the interview successfully. So I ended up writing a pretty extensive script in preparation that I was able to reference throughout the conversation and like prevent myself from needing to improvise at all. In the past, I probably would not have taken this proactive measure and just sort of sat and antagonized with it and then gone in, all the more worried. But instead, I took the time to figure out why I was worried, which was mostly comprehension over the phone, leading to mistakes in the document. And then I figured out how I could address it by writing the script. And this accommodation now comes naturally to me, but it's not something that I would always have been confident about doing. So I was glad to have that developed from Smith. I also think that problem-solving skills really came in handy here, and the ability to look past the face value of a task to accomplish it. Also Spanish at Smith. I've been learning Spanish since 6th grade, but since being at Smith, I've grown a lot more confident in communicating in both academic and colloquial settings. And I would definitely not have been able to succeed in my internship without that. And as for Jesus's case, last I heard, his hearing has been postponed again to later this spring. So I'm hoping for a positive outcome, and we'll look forward to hearing about hopefully the good things that come out of it. And so reflecting and looking forward, through this position, I saw firsthand some of the ups and downs of nonprofit work. Some of the pros were that Keep Tucson Together is community-based, it's collectivist, and it's pretty collaborative, which I really appreciated. But some of the cons were that such demanding work meant that other things like organization and communication were not always able to be prioritized. And if I continue to do this work in the future, I'm going to make sure to prioritize sort of maintaining organizational strategies and communication strategies so that the focus can be on the work instead of perhaps like the interpersonal dilemmas that can come up from this type of work. Also, I will say that the lack of stability was also frustrating because it was all contingent on the administration. Like the prosecutorial discretion example that I referenced before. And then also in June, the Biden administration overturned a precedent called Matter of AB that basically prevented women fleeing domestic abuse from being treated as a particular social group, which was a positive change, but it made us have to reevaluate a large number of cases because a lot of the clients had been in abusive situations in their countries of origin. I also gained perspective from working in a system that continuously proves itself to be inhumane and intertwined with American white supremacy and patriarchal ideals. It was definitely discouraging to work hard with people who had fled all sorts of persecution, knowing that their cases would almost definitely be rejected and they would not receive asylum. And I also saw firsthand how a lot of Tucson staff felt burned out and even secondhand traumatized themselves from the continued sort of disappointment and stress of that knowledge. But my time at Smith, and specifically my American and Jewish studies courses, have equipped me with more tools to visualize a future where oppressive systems like US immigration are no longer in place. In recent months, I've turned to learning about ideas of border abolition that are really energizing and call for direct action against the system we operate under now. And I'm also hoping to get involved in some asylum initiatives in Western Mass. And then in the rest of my Smith career, I'm hoping to take classes that deal more directly with immigration, which will allow me to combine my practical experience with academic approaches and encourage a more well-rounded perspective. My internship also reaffirmed my interest in human rights law, and whether I pursue immigration law or another area, I will certainly take what I learned this summer and at Smith with me. So thank you so much for listening today. Thank you also to Emily for all of your help. And I've put some links here where you can learn a little bit more about Keep Tucson Together and also sort of an introduction to border abolition if you're interested. So thank you again. And yeah, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Eliza. And I welcome the audience to enter their questions if anyone has any. But I can get it started. I'm hoping that all of the panelists could let us know how they found their internship, what path led them to their internship if they didn't already explain.
I'm happy to start. My working at the Philistine Historical Society, actually, it just kind of came about. My middle school English teacher's father is actually the president of the Philistine Historical Society. So I just sent him an email one day because I was interested. And with the Praxis program at Smith College, it was just really easy to set up. I feel like having weird connections like that can be very helpful. And I feel like emailing people is a good idea.
Yeah, mine was also a praxis position, and it was specifically for Smith students. So I got emailed it from a ton of different places, actually. The Lazarus Center sent emails about the position that I did, and then also one of my professors in the Africana Studies department also sent it. So that was how I found out about it.
Good to read those emails, right?
Very important.
Yeah, and I had come across the volunteer opportunity on like a Smith parents page and reached out that way. And then once the summer came, I basically talked to the people I had already been working with and expressed interest in more of a time commitment and like more responsibility. And that's how I ended up doing that this summer.
Thank you. And again, for those of you who haven't already gone over this, were there any courses at Smith that you sort of noticed helped prepare you for these experiences, or even extracurricular activities? Were you drawing on any of that, any of those skills in your internships?
Okay, I'll go. I think a lot of my courses at Smith have definitely been reading focused. As I said, I'm an Africana Studies major, and a lot of my work is just reading, and also a lot of writing, and we have a lot of discussions in classes. So I think that just like knowing how to, I don't want to just say knowing how to read, but just like knowing how to space out what I'm reading has definitely helped, because that was what majority of my work was this summer, and just knowing how to like block out the time that I'm doing So I think that's probably one of the main ways that I was prepared to do the work that I did.
Yeah, I think my first semester at Smith, I took first year 115, which was reading the Civil War. Uh, and that class, I had never done more reading or writing in my life. I think I wrote like 12 essays that semester. And I think like just reading so many primary documents kind of got me in that mindset of like, oh, well, maybe like I would really enjoy doing history and like looking at archival studies and doing all of that. And then I took the Gateway course for the archives, which introduced me to kind of questions about how you research and introduced me to like archival dilemmas and things like that. And that kind of got me into that mindset.
Yeah, I would also echo what both of you just said. I think having the ability to like go through enormous amounts of information and kind of pick out the part that's going to be useful at the time was really helpful, especially for like collecting documents and things like I was just talking about. And yeah, I think the ability to like manage one's time well was really important, especially in a remote scenario, because there wasn't as much constant like interaction with supervisors and things like that.
Thank you. I think Eliza touched on this a bit in her presentation, but I'm wondering if your hands-on experience changed your perception of the work in the fields in which you interned. Did you sort of have a preconceived notion going into it, and then once you actually did the work, did you feel differently about it at the end of the summer?
Well, I certainly had the preconceived notion that working at an archives would entail actually going in. Well, we did do some of that, but I thought it would be a lot of just like spending a lot of time in the stacks and like opening up dusty books and things like that. But it was so much doing it online was a very different kind of experience for me. But I think it kind of made me open my mind to like, you can do research, you can have an archive in any kind of medium. Yeah, just really opened my mind to that.
I think for me, I hadn't really taken too many history classes at Smith before I did my summer project. And I think I definitely had preconceived notions about like the field of history. And after doing this project, I think I just realized like how important it is and how fun it is to work with like historical materials. So I think that's probably how my views have changed about it.
Yeah, I think this was also my first entry into like the immigration law field, including at Smith. I had never taken really any classes dealing with it. And I think I was most surprised by the, I don't know a better word than vibe. It was much less strict and like rigorous than I had anticipated. There was a lot of, like I was talking about, there was a ton of collaboration and less of a hierarchy than I might have imagined. I was also surprised at how few lawyers worked there, and that sort of opened my mind into other realms of jobs and things that could be interesting in the future, because there were a lot of people doing really interesting work in the law field without law degrees, and that was something I wasn't as aware of. So
interesting. Thank you for sharing. I don't know if our audience has any more questions, but I'm going to keep it going. One more question I have. As you know, Smithies are currently on the search for their summer internships for 2022. So do you have any advice for Smithies who are looking for internships right now?
You go ahead, Eliza.
I was just gonna say, I think starting early is good, like nowish, because they creep up on you. And also, like Georgia was saying, I think just like finding an organization that you're interested in and reaching out to them, I think could have a lot more benefits than people might imagine, especially if they're not like advertising that they're hiring and you're expressing interest that way. I think that could be a good move.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think for me, limiting geography of like where I wanted to work definitely helped because searching for stuff everywhere in the country online is very overwhelming. Uh, I think also when you reach out to organizations, just be yourself and be enthusiastic. Especially if you're using the Praxis program, a lot of smaller organizations will be super happy to hear about your interest. Yeah, so don't be nervous.
Yeah, I think that I would say just stay open to different opportunities. Like I said, I never expected to go to Cleveland, but I think it was a really wonderful opportunity. And also, like I said, I worked at a performing arts center, and I would not really consider myself to be a performing artist, but you don't know what type of positions, are offered at these places. So I think just staying open to a lot of different fields. And also like look at the emails that the Lazarus Center sends as well, because they have a lot of good stuff.
I love that advice, Nyla. All right, if no one else in the audience has any questions, I guess this concludes today's panel for the Smith in the World Conference. As a reminder, we have one more panel coming up next week, the research and data analysis panel. I'm going to pop that registration link into the chat, but you can also find it on the Smith in the World website. So thank you so much to our wonderful presenters, and thank you to our audience, and have a great weekend, everyone.